Okay, so I've got Mr Viera here. Thanks for discussing with me about the assessment criteria that we use when we're marking for a composition. So if we have a look at this assessment criteria here, there are three points that we look at. So the first one is stylistic understanding. What's your take on that, the stylistic understanding?
So with stylistic understanding, it's all about how well you capture the style or the genre of music that you've chosen to do as part of your topic. Mm-hmm. So for example, let's say that you choose to do a piece of that you study jazz as your topic. Then what they're looking for is how well has your composition captured that style of jazz.
Okay.
So there are specific things that a piece of jazz music might have that you might use. For example, it might have a walking bass line. So does your composition use a walking bass line as an example? It might have use of extended chords like seventh chords and ninth chord and so on. So how well have you used those chords in your composition? So it's about showing, because the more of this music you listen to, so the more jazz you listen to, the more you pick up the little nuances for it. So you know what the drums do, you know how the horns interact and so on.
Yes.
So how well does your topic represent that?
Mm-hmm.
How well does your composition represent the topic? And that's the first criteria.
Okay. All right, so then the second one is understanding musical concepts and the relationships between them.
Yeah, so that's looking at the 6 concepts of music: pitch, duration, tone, colour, structure, texture, and dynamics and expressive techniques. Mm-hmm. And what they're looking at is, by the time you've gotten to the end of the composition, how well have you incorporated all of them? So have you got an interesting use of structure? Have you got, with regards to pitch, it might be with regards to the melody or the harmony that you've used. Mm-hmm. With tone colour, have you used variations in the instruments? So it's all about, it's not like they're ticking off, yes, you've used pitch and yes, you've used tone colour. It's more that holistically, have you covered all the concepts in a creative way where you've shown your skill level with incorporating that.
Okay.
At the same time as capturing the stylistic understanding.
All right, okay.
So depending on the style of music, there are some things that are really important, or some concepts that are more important than in others. So, for example, in rock music, the changes in dynamics isn't as critical as, say, in a style of I don't know, classical art music, where there's a wide range of dynamics. Well, quite often in rock and pop music, the dynamics are somewhat flat. I mean, there is change, and I'd encourage you to add it in. But that's an example of how dynamics would be used differently in the different styles.
Okay. All right, good. And then the last point they have is knowledge of score conventions and performance directions.
Yeah, the way I interpret that is how accurate is your notation? Mm-hmm. Can you get your notated piece of music, give it to a group of musicians, and can they accurately represent what you've intended? Mm-hmm. And if they can't, that means that your notation isn't accurate enough.
Okay.
So it really comes down to, could you give this to other musicians, and can they be able to play it without having to ask questions about, hey, what do you mean here? Is this a crotch or is this a quaver? Because I can't understand it. Mm-hmm. What's this symbol over here mean that I've never seen before? So it's about being able to replicate your music. Now, a basic composition might only have the notes and the bars correct and the correct number of beats and so on, but a more advanced composition is going to have like the dynamic indications, it's going to have tempo, it might have articulations. So it's got all the things that help the musician know exactly how you want it to play.
Yeah, I know. I find that sometimes some students say if they're writing for guitar and they're writing scoring out the rhythm patterns of chords they're playing, often they'll write the chords like a piano score and not like how a guitarist would play it. So that is a big difference there in knowing accurately how the person who's playing that instrument, how they would need to play it properly.
Yep. A good approach with this is to have a look at how music is written specifically for that instrument, and look at other examples of music and then incorporate that.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially if you're writing for instruments that you're not that familiar with. Like we had this example of one of our students just yesterday who had written for the trumpet, and it sounded fine, but I said to her, I think that note's too low. And when we looked into it, it was physically impossible to play that note on the trumpet, but in the software she was using, it actually didn't indicate that. So It was a change. So even understanding that, with regards to the score conventions and the performance directions, you can't direct a performer to play something that physically is not possible on that instrument.
That's right. Okay.
It's like sometimes if you're doing drums and say you've got 4 limbs, so you've got your right hand, your left hand, left foot, right foot, but in the drum notation, might have 5 or 6 things being hit at once, which is physically impossible to hit the 6, potentially. I mean, there might be a way around it, but under normal circumstances, short of hitting like one stick and hitting 2 things at the same time. So it's looking at the performance directions need to be appropriate for that instrument. We regularly find people that will write, say, for flute or trumpet, and they've written 2 notes at once, but there's only one instrument, and under normal circumstances, that's not a practical or easy thing to do. So that's one part, but the other part is making sure that your score, the music notation, is accurate so that other musicians can play.
Okay, all right, good. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about, okay, so if we were looking in the marking guidelines here, the first point covers the style, understanding of style. The second point understands knowledge of the score conventions, which we were just talking about. And this last one is demonstrates high levels of skills in organising ideas into musical structures. So can we just talk about that third point there, because that's really the basis of how to do a composition. And so what are they looking for when they're looking for in that top band now?
So one of the things they're looking for is, can you write a idea, like a musical idea, and then can you do stuff to that idea to show that you've got a high level of skill in organising it? So it's like, imagine if you were making, I don't know, a jumper, and so I'm wearing a basic black jumper. So what if I was going to make a variation to that jumper? I might put some buttons on there. So it's still the same jumper. So structurally, I've repeated the same thing, but I've added some buttons to create a variation. And then I might do another version of the jumper where I cut off the sleeves and make it into a vest. So essentially it's the same thing, but there's a change to it. So think of your musical ideas in terms of, here's my idea and here's a variation, here's something else that I've done to it, so that you can show that, hey, I'm not just repeating the same thing over and over again, I'm actually making a change to create interest.
Okay.
So that's one component of it.
All right. So can you give me an example of a common problem that students do when they're organising their musical ideas?
So let's say they have, let's just use a bit of a popular song structure. So you might have verse 1, and then you might have chorus, and then verse 2, and then you might have chorus. And for verse 1 and verse 2, they get exactly the same music and more or less cut and pasted over here with no changes to it.
Okay.
So structurally, yes, it's representing the topic, because that's if you were writing a pop song, that would be a common structure. But in terms of showing a high level of skill, you're simply grabbing something and not making changes to it and sticking it over here with no changes to it at all. So some of the things that you potentially could change are what the melody does. You might make a little variation to it, or add some extra notes, or take away some notes. If it's a drum pattern, you might have a slight change in the rhythm pattern. If it's a bass line, you might keep it the same for the first one, and then the second time you might double up on a note or add a little change. So it's the more of that you show, the more skill that you're demonstrating.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Another way that I sometimes refer to with my students is, imagine if you're cooking a meal for someone, you say, hey, I want you to cook for me everything that you've got to show. And they come up and they give me like a piece of buttered bread.
Okay.
Which, and yes, theoretically that could be considered a meal because it's something that you eat. But if I compare it to a student who gets a piece of bread and they make it into garlic bread, and then they have a piece of salmon next to it, and they've got some chips, and they've got a salad, and they've got the whole lot. So the second person has shown a greater level of skill in organising food than the first person, and that's kind of, think of it musically that way.
Okay. All right. I know, we were discussing earlier today, a common thing is in melody writing. Say, for instance, students will do the basic in terms of they'll use the notes from the chord when they're constructing their melody. But for them to develop it further, they could add passing notes and things like that to make it sound more interesting.
Chromaticism, changes in rhythm. Yes.
All right, to make it, and that's how you develop it like that. Whereas if you're just using notes from a chord, it seems more like, that's just like a average or a basic thing to do.
That's going to work, But it's probably you're demonstrating skill in organising musical ideas. Maybe you're demonstrating proficient skills, but you're not demonstrating a high level of skill because you're only ever using, say, the same notes from a triad.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, then finally, is there any other advice that you could give students in when they're creating composition?
Yeah. Composition is just like learning an instrument. Or it's just like developing your oral skills in that you need to practice. And the mistake that students sometimes make is that they say, all right, I'm going to do composition for year 11 and 12, and they write one composition for their assessment, and then they wait for their HSC and they write another composition, and that's it. And it doesn't matter what you do. If you only ever do it twice or 3 or 4 times, you're not going to get great at it.
Yeah.
And the way to get good at it is that you've got to consistently compose. The students that rock this out and do an awesome job, it's because they're consistently composing. And there's a massive difference between writing one piece that you submit for your HSC compared to the musician who writes 6 or 7 pieces of music.
Yeah.
There's even a bigger difference between the student that writes one piece of jazz music and hands that in compared to the student that writes 6 or 7 pieces of jazz music in their year 11 and 12, plus they listen to lots of jazz music. So whatever style you choose, immerse yourself in that, get to understand the little details, the finer points of that style of music, exactly how they play things, and then incorporate it into your composition, and be prepared to make constant revisions. It's really difficult to get a composition where you look back and go, it's 100% perfect, there's nothing else that I can do. What tends to happen, especially at HSC level, is that you get it to a point where, okay, I've now got to hand it in.
Okay, or where you just let it go.
Where you kind of just accept where you're at and let it go. But up until that point, keep making the revisions and keep on looking at what you can improve. And if you get to a point where you're totally comfortable with it, leave it as is, start your next composition.
Yeah, because with more practice, obviously, you're going to, your understanding of composition will just improve.
Yep. Yeah, so really immerse yourself in it and treat it like an instrument in that it takes practice and you need to be disciplined with it as well. The trap a lot of students will do is that a couple of weeks before their composition, they jump in and all of a sudden they start madly composing, trying to put something together. Whereas the consistent students are doing it every week or every couple of days, or the really top ones are just composing, every day.
Yeah.
They sit down and just write something, they muck around with it, they play with it.
Yeah, that's right, and it gives them time to think about it as well, doesn't it? In the development of it.
Another piece of another advice is to grab the sheet music or the score for a piece of music and do lots of score reading so that you listen to the recording of it and you follow the music so you can see what someone else has done successfully to create their piece of music as well. And identify the structure, work out what the chords are doing. So do a lot of music analysis so that you can see music-wise how it's being written.
All right. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mr Viera, for your talk today, and I hope everyone finds our talk helpful. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.